Welcome to the Explainer. Okay, let's dive into this, because today we're exploring the absolutely fascinating academic work of Dr. George Payton. We're going to be looking at the hidden linguistic gymnastics required to translate ancient texts. Because, when you're reading a text that's thousands of years old, you aren't just crossing a language barrier. No, you are crossing an enormous cultural canyon. To tackle this, we've got a clear roadmap today. We'll hit the translation dilemma, playing the name game, building meaningful bridges, measuring the ancient world, the problem with money, and finally, bridging ancient and modern. Let's kick things off with Section 1, the translation dilemma. So, it's time to shatter a really common misconception right out of the gate. Translation is almost never as simple as just swapping a word in language A for a matching word in language B. Let me ask you, how do you translate an idea that doesn't even exist in the language you're translating into? Just imagine trying to explain the concept of distance to a remote culture that has literally no vehicles, no standardized rulers, no clocks. How do you communicate a concept they have absolutely no experience with? And that brings us perfectly to Dr. Payton's core concept, which he calls unknown ideas. These are basically concepts in the original ancient languages that just simply do not exist in the culture, the world, or the language of the target audience. So the crucial point is, translators have to translate the underlying concepts, not just the literal words on the page, if they actually want the text to mean something to the person reading it. Moving right along to Section 2, playing the name game.
This is our first specific category of unknown ideas, and it deals with the phonetic challenge of specific biblical names. You see, when translating specific people or places, translators usually transliterate. Basically, that means they find the closest equivalent sounds in the target language. Like, you can see how the Greek word apostolos just naturally shifts into apostle in English. But oh man, it gets tricky. In Swahili, for instance, they don't use consonant clusters together. So a basic English word like driver needs some extra vowels and it becomes derava. Or say a language completely lacks an R sound, kind of like a rooster's crow, that usually just turns into an ah sound. It's actually a lot like a Boston accent, right? Where father becomes father. Translators literally have to mold the sounds to fit the local tongue.
Which brings us to Section 3, building meaningful bridges.
So, what happens when just transliterating a name perfectly isn't enough to convey what the original text meant? That's the challenge of contextual meaning. Consider this very literal, strict translation of a passage. In those days, Jesus came from Nazareth in Galilee and was baptized by John in the Jordan. Well, if you have zero geographical background and you're reading this in a completely different culture, how in the world would you know if Judah or Galilee or Jordan were people, tribes, mountains, or lakes? But look at what happens when we adjust the text just a little bit. In those days, Jesus came from the town of Nazareth in the Galilee region and was baptized by John in the Jordan River. And this brilliantly illustrates how translators build bridges. By explicitly adding town of or region, they completely remove that stumbling block for the reader. And the best part? They're doing this without adding any brand new unbiblical information to the text. The geography was always there, right? The reader just needed a little bit of context to see it. And it gets even more complex when we start dealing with figures of speech. Take this ancient phrase, woe to you, Chorazin. Now, this is metonymy. Jesus wasn't cursing the literal wood, dirt, and stone buildings of the towns Chorazin or Bethsaida, obviously not. He was using personification to address the actual people living in those towns. So a really great translation bridge here might say, woe to you people from the town of Chorazin. That simple tweak makes the true meaning instantly clear to anyone, anywhere in the world. All right, Section 4, measuring the ancient world. This is where things get really fun. We're going to explore the incredibly culturally creative workarounds translators use for ancient measurements. Take the ancient cubit, which is roughly 18 inches. When you're trying to translate the massive dimensions of Noah's Ark for the Orma people, translators actually use the word dundun. That's their exact cultural equivalent, measuring from the elbow to the fingertips. And what about an ancient liquid measure of roughly 10 gallons? Well, translated to the Orma language, it perfectly becomes 2 debe. A debe is a familiar 5-gallon jerry can that local women use every single day. Or, get this one, consider fathoms for measuring water depth. For the Bungu fishermen in Tanzania, a fathom is brilliantly translated by referencing human wingspans. They are literally measuring how many people deep the water is. How cool is that? Actually, Dr. Payton shares this fascinating, kind of hilarious anecdote from the source material that perfectly captures this whole cultural gap. He was talking to a man in Tanzania and asked him how far away he lived outside of town. The man's reply, about 40 cents.
He didn't measure distance in miles or minutes, he measured it by the exact cost of taking a public bush taxi. I mean, think about it. If you translate an ancient walking distance literally to a culture that measures distance by taxi fare, the communication totally breaks down. It just fails.
Let's turn to Section 5, the problem with money.
Welcome to the ultimate boss fight of translation, economic value. Because, let's face it, money is constantly shifting underneath our feet thanks to inflation. Dr. Payton uses this really relatable gas price analogy to explain it. If you say a gallon of gas costs $2.50 in Texas, but it's over $4 in California, well, the actual physical volume of the liquid stays exactly the same, but the value of the dollar shifts. Because of inflation, if you try to use fixed modern currencies like dollars or pesos to translate ancient money, it's just going to fail over time. So translators absolutely have to use relative cultural equivalents. Like for extreme poverty, such as the widow's mite story, Swahili translators might use the term ndururu. That's a tiny, tiny fraction of a cent. And by using that word, the audience instantly feels the heavy emotional reality of her having absolutely nothing.
But what about the other end of the spectrum? What about massive, unbelievable wealth? Look at the climactic hyperbole from the famous parable of the unforgiving servant. He owed his master 10,000 talents. Now, just to put that into perspective for a second, a single ancient talent equals roughly 6,000 days of work. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is when we look at the modern equivalent of that debt, the scale is just mind-blowing. 10,000 talents equals roughly 150 years of daily wages. That's about $60 million. Translating this literal hyperbole into a modern figure, like $60 million, or even phrasing it as lifetimes of wages, perfectly preserves the original emotional shock value. The reader instantly gasps and grasps that it's a completely unpayable sum, exactly the way the original ancient audience did when they first heard it. Finally, we arrive at Section 6, Bridging Ancient and Modern. Let's wrap things up and look at the resolution of our explainer. Because what happens when finding a perfect cultural equivalent is simply too clunky, or it just takes way too many words? In those cases, translators rely on highly effective technical safety nets to keep the core text clean and readable without, overburdening it with massive, clunky explanations. Translators brilliantly utilize paratextual information. They'll drop in concise footnotes or build these incredibly comprehensive glossaries at the back of the book. So a reader can see the literal word talent in the text, preserving that historical flavor, but they can easily flip to the glossary to understand exactly how much weight or money that term actually represents. It really is the best of both worlds. As Dr. Payton so forcefully emphasizes, the golden rule of translation is this: the goal is effective communication, not literal confusion. Think about it. Leaving a reader utterly confused by a rigid, literal, one-to-one translation is the exact opposite of accuracy. If a text meant something profound and emotional to an ancient reader, but leaves a modern reader scratching their head, feeling absolutely nothing, well, the translation has basically failed its primary mission. Which brings us to a final, sort of provocative thought for you to ponder. Is translating concepts instead of just strictly literal words, is that tampering with the text? Or is it finally making it truly accurate? When we prioritize human understanding across these vast cultural divides, we aren't changing the original message, we're ensuring it survives. And honestly, that is arguably the highest form of linguistic respect.